Hello, this is David with Stupid Things People Do and what we can learn from them. We've been talking the last weeks about the EEOC guidelines and what they mean for your organization. That means we're laser focusing on harassment and discrimination, which, while we can viciously mock the perpetrators, we need to be really careful to respect the victims. But what happens when that gets muddy? And how could that ever get muddy, one might ask? Well, in our bullying series, we talked about Dwight Schrute syndrome, where a bystander might misidentify a workplace bully based on their victim's lack of popularity. But we've also discussed the more obvious Mean Girls doom spiral. In an effort to protect myself from the horde of attorneys who audit my work, it is important that I note a Mean Girls doom spiral is not at all endemic to the feminine gender. You may remember from How to Frame Friends and Influence People that guys are just as capable of the kind of deluded insanity I'm going to describe. But Mean Girls is a funny movie, and the moniker does fit. So, what is a Mean Girls doom spiral? Well, it's what happens when someone listens to the weasels that are piloting their brain and decides not just to harass, but seek the ultimate ruination of their potential victim. It's like if Sauron had the impulse control of a chihuahua and the emotional maturity of a 12-year-old on ketamine. Past examples of this were both Bark If You're Dirty and The Narcissist King. These walking HR violations who starred in those stories took Andrew Tate's lifestyle not as a warning sign, but as an aspirational identity, and proceeded to bombard their female coworkers with inappropriate advances, solicitations, and photos. And when that went about as well as a normal person would expect, they tried to have their victims fired. We've talked at length about that problem, but rarely have we gotten into the details of what happens after these people get caught. So, today's example. Meet Genevieve, the alleged victim in our story. According to her lawsuit, she was sexually harassed and retaliatorily discharged from her workplace, and she provided evidence in the form of her text message history. One that, well, she couldn't actually access because the original phone's screen is cracked and it has an ink bleed. And the new phone, well, it's locked out. She does have a totally legitimate and definitely not Photoshopped JPEG of the text messages. And yeah, it looks a bit weird, but that's because of the transition from the iPhone 5 to the iPhone 7. Obviously, the forensics experts didn't buy that explanation for why the screenshots looked like they'd been Jenga'd together from several different sources, and they came back with a different conclusion than Genevieve was putting forward. It's a fake. Now, at this point, you would think that Genevieve would back down on her evidence claim. She lied, she got caught, but what you're missing is that people caught up in their Mean Girls doom spiral don't usually back down from a blatant lie. They escalate. Facing a motion for dismissal and sanctions, her story expanded. Something about the screen not being cracked and then becoming cracked, but it was flickering and then it wasn't flickering, so she took a picture, but now it's flickering again, and an iPhone X is involved. Anyway, the court turned it over to further forensic review, and that review found that Genevieve had fabricated a document, given false testimony, and spoliated evidence to cover up the fabrication. So, that's the doom spiral. It's like the others we've discussed, a chihuahua and ketamine. But what actually happens next? Well, charges for one, perjury is on there, spoliating evidence is on there, fraud is on there. But rather than engaging in these criminal processes, instead the court used its power to impose sanctions directly. But what about due process, one might ask? Even the most frothy of Chihuahua people, of course, do deserve due process. But see, the thing is Genevieve's behavior measurably cost both the court and the defendant money. And the more she doubled down, the more measurable the damage she was causing became. That gave the court powers to sanction her to cover those costs. So in one sense, it's not so much a punishment without due process, so much as ensuring plaintiffs can't sidestep due process and punish others in an endless, frivolous legal double-down. It's kind of like how courts award attorney fees. Due process protects you from a lot of stuff, but not your own sociopathic stupidity. But more than that, the court actually penalized Genevieve's attorneys as well. We'll call them Atlas and Kids. That's a made-up name. The court's reasoning? Well, they were faced with multiple indications that Genevieve might have been lying about the whole cell phone thing, and they had multiple chances to investigate and make sure they were not facilitating false evidence and other such idiocy. They did not. Not only that, but even after the lies were discovered, Atlas and Kids filed frivolous cross motions for sanctions against the defendant for reasons. Lawyer note, I'm actually not really quoting, I'm making things up. At no point did Atlas and Kids or the judge cite reasons as the cause for the cross sanctions, but they might as well have. The rationale behind those sanctions is so nonsensical. I can no more rationally represent their logic than I could describe the timeline of the alleged cracked screen phone flicker thing. I think that perhaps Genevieve and her attorneys were relying on shock and confusion surrounding the audacity of their behavior to carry the day. And while that might work on meek and introverted coworkers who are just trying to survive a loud and confusing workplace, that is not going to work on a judge. Anyway, these things are usually appealed, and this was no exception. Surprising no one, the higher court upheld most of the decisions, except for the sanction for Atlas and Kids. The court couldn't figure out whether their complicity was due to acting in bad faith or just being complete morons. Well, they didn't say complete morons. That's my paraphrase, again. Anyway, what does this all go to say? Well, it highlights a pitfall, one that is not popular to acknowledge. Automatically believing the alleged victims is dangerous. Oh boy, does that sound controversial. It conjures up the 2016 Believe Her campaigns. So before anyone catches on fire, let me unpack that a little bit. When victims of trauma or abuse share their story, a legitimate fear is that they won't be believed. When that happens, they not only have to deal with their original trauma, but now they have to deal with the alienation of being disbelieved and disregarded. So interpersonally, when someone we love comes to us with trauma, it's not our job to prove or disprove the facts. It's our job to act in an appropriate way in our relationship. So for me, that usually means trying to listen to the person, empathize, and help them find healing. But for an investigator, that appropriate response is going to be very different from my interpersonal response. Legal and investigative processes are supposed to focus on justice and truth. So if investigators or attorneys don't focus on truth and justice, but instead allow a knee-jerk belief or disbelief of a victim to inform their processes, the truth becomes compromised. In a worst-case scenario, you get someone like Genevieve who lies and causes immediate demonstrable harm. In a best-case scenario, you still undermine the credibility and reliability of the entire process. Legal processes and investigations must be unbiased. While therapeutic processes are incredibly important, when things get muddy, investigations and legal processes still have to remain focused on facts, or else they risk amplifying the harm instead of bringing healing. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.